Handcuffed and humiliated in broad daylight. That was how David Carter, the director of the FBI, found himself one fateful afternoon. Despite his impeccable suit and the badge that symbolized his authority, he was treated like a common criminal by a single officer intent on making a point. The buzzing crowd recorded every moment, their disbelief and outrage echoing in the air. It wasn't just an insult to David, it was a chilling demonstration of what happens when power goes unchecked. But what the officer didn't realize was that this arrest would be the beginning of his own reckoning. A storm was about to erupt, one that would expose deep cracks in the system and ignite a movement for justice. Before we dive into this gripping tale of power, injustice, and accountability, comment below where you're watching from today. And if you're drawn to stories like this one, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss another compelling journey. David Carter, the 47-year-old director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI, carried himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to navigating high-stakes situations. His crisp gray suit and polished shoes radiated authority, reflecting the gravity of his role in safeguarding national security. It was a busy afternoon in Washington, D.C., and David had just wrapped up a vital meeting with the Attorney General. Discussions had revolved around pressing strategies to combat escalating national threats, a responsibility David took deeply to heart. Despite the intensity of the meeting, his day was far from over. A long list of tasks awaited him back at his office. As he exited the government building, the urban symphony of the bustling streets greeted him. Car horns blaring, hurried footsteps, and snippets of conversations blending into a cacophony of life. David crossed the street, his mind already outlining the next set of priorities. His car was parked a short distance away, and the leather briefcase in his hand contained classified documents requiring his immediate attention. But something felt off. As David neared his car, an unsettling sensation crept over him, the distinct feeling of being watched. He glanced up, his seasoned instincts kicking in. Just a few steps away from his vehicle stood a police officer. The man, likely in his mid-40s, had a buzz cut and a posture that screamed authority. Arms crossed, his scrutinizing gaze locked on David like a predator assessing its prey. David used to command attention, but rarely this kind. He straightened his back and walked toward his car. He was determined to brush off the uncomfortable moment as nothing more than a misplaced assumption. But as he approached, the officer stepped forward, his movements sharp and deliberate. "Now," the officer barked, his tone devoid of courtesy, dripping with unearned superiority. Momentarily caught off guard, David stopped. His years of training had taught him to de-escalate tense situations, and he applied that skill now. "Excuse me, officer," he said, his voice calm and measured. "May I ask what this is about?" "You're acting suspicious," the officer retorted without hesitation. David's eyebrows rose slightly. "Suspicious? In a tailored suit, briefcase in hand, on a government street?" The absurdity was almost laughable, but the officer's expression made it clear he wasn't joking. Suppressing his irritation, David reached into his pocket and retrieved his wallet. "My name is David Carter," he stated, presenting his ID. "I'm the director of the FBI." The badge and credentials gleamed in the sunlight, an unequivocal testament to his identity and authority. Under normal circumstances, this should have ended the conversation, but the officer's jaw clenched as he barely glanced at the ID. "Hands on the hood," he ordered, pulling out a pair of handcuffs. For a split second, David thought this was some kind of ill-conceived prank. He maintained his composure but firmly addressed the officer. "You do realize who I am, don't you?" The officer's hand hovered dangerously close to his holster. "On the hood." Now. By this point, pedestrians had taken notice. Some slowed their steps, others stopped altogether, their faces betraying curiosity and disbelief. Phones were pulled out, cameras began rolling. A woman shouted, "Do you even know who that is?" While another man chimed in, "That's the director of the FBI." The officer, unbothered, remained resolute. David, though seething internally, understood the stakes. Escalating the situation wouldn't serve anyone. He complied, placing his hands on the cold surface of his car. The cuffs clicked shut around his wrists, the metal biting into his skin. It wasn't just humiliating, it was infuriating. Whispers in the crowd grew louder. "This is unbelievable," one person muttered. How could they not know who he is? David took a deep breath, locking his emotions away. Years of leading high-pressure operations had honed his ability to remain calm under fire. But as he stood there, surrounded by a gathering audience, one thought burned brightly in his mind. This isn't over. The cold cuffs around David Carter's wrists were a sharp reminder of the surreal situation unfolding as a man who had dedicated his life to upholding justice. Being treated like a common criminal was an indignity he hadn't prepared for. The officer, whose name tag read Charles Thompson, tightened his grip on David's arm, forcing him to stay pressed against the hood of his car. Around them, the murmuring crowd grew louder, their disbelief now turning into open outrage. "Are you seriously arresting him?" a woman called out, her voice tinged with indignation. "That's David Carter, the FBI director," another man added. "What's wrong with you? He's literally the head of law enforcement in this country." Charles remained unfazed. To him, this was his moment, a chance to assert his authority without question. Ignoring the outcry and the cameras pointed at him, he continued the arrest. "Officer," David said, turning his head slightly to make eye contact, "you're making a grave mistake. Do you realize you're violating federal laws right now?" "Quiet," Charles snapped, his voice cutting through the din of the crowd. He shoved David harder against the car, causing a collective gasp from the onlookers. "You have the right to remain silent. I suggest you use it." It was becoming painfully clear that Charles wasn't interested in reasoning or recognizing his error. Instead, he seemed intent on showcasing his power, no matter how misplaced or destructive it was. David felt the sting of humiliation. Here he was, a figure of authority, reduced to a public spectacle. Yet, he knew that losing his composure would only fuel the officer's arrogance. Instead, he focused on the bigger picture, the growing crowd, the dozens of smartphones capturing every second of this debacle. As Charles led David to the patrol car, the crowd began to chant, "Let him go! Let him go!" The officer ignored them, opening the back door and shoving David inside with unnecessary force. The car door slammed shut, muffling the voices outside, but not silencing them entirely. Through the window, David could see people pressing closer, their faces a mix of anger and disbelief. Someone held up their phone, speaking loudly enough for him to hear. "This is going to blow up online. Just watch." David didn't doubt it for a second. The drive to the precinct was tense. Charles glanced at him through the rearview mirror a few times, his expression unreadable. Whether it was guilt, defiance, or something else entirely, David couldn't tell. What he did know was that this officer had no idea of the storm he had just unleashed. When they arrived at the station, David was escorted inside like a high-profile fugitive. Other officers in the room paused, their eyes narrowing in confusion as they recognized him. Whispers spread like wildfire. "Wait, is that? Does he know who he just brought in? This can't be real." Charles, however, remained oblivious, filling out paperwork with an air of smug satisfaction. It was clear he believed he had done something heroic. Bookmark. David sat in a rigid chair in the booking area, the cuffs still biting into his wrists. He maintained a calm exterior, but inside he seethed. The absurdity of the situation wasn't just an insult to him, it was a glaring example of unchecked power. One of the other officers approached Charles cautiously. Thompson," he began, his voice low. "Are you absolutely sure about this?" Charles shot him a glare. He was acting suspicious, he replied curtly, clearly unwilling to entertain dissent. "But that's David Carter," the officer insisted, his tone bordering on disbelief. Charles waved him off. "I don't care if he's the president. He was suspicious, and I did my job." David watched the exchange quietly, noting the unease spreading through the room. More officers were glancing at their phones, likely seeing the videos that were already going viral. The atmosphere grew heavier with every passing moment. It all came to a head about 30 minutes later. The phone at the front desk rang, cutting through the tension. The desk sergeant answered, and his expression immediately darkened. His posture stiffened, and he whispered something to another officer before storming toward Charles. "What on earth have you done?" the sergeant hissed, his voice sharp enough to silence the room. "You arrested the director of the FBI?" Charles froze, his bravado faltering for the first time. I was just... Save it," the sergeant snapped, pointing at David. "Get those cuffs off him, now." Charles fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking as he unlocked the cuffs. David stood up, adjusting his suit and rubbing his wrists. He fixed Charles with a piercing look that conveyed a lifetime's worth of judgment in a single moment. "Apologies, sir," Charles mumbled, avoiding eye contact. "It was a misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding?" David repeated, his tone cold and precise. "That's what you're going with?" The room fell silent. No one dared to move as David's words hung in the air. Charles's face turned crimson, and he stammered an incoherent response. The sergeant stepped in, his voice strained. "Sir, please accept our apologies. This was an unfortunate mistake." David held his gaze for a moment before replying. "Unfortunate indeed. Don't worry, I'll ensure it's corrected." With that, he turned and walked out of the station. But as he left, he knew this wasn't the end. Charles Thompson had no idea what kind of consequences were coming his way. As David Carter stepped out of the precinct, the cold December air hit his face, a stark contrast to the simmering anger inside him. He had faced high-stakes situations countless times in his career, but this wasn't just personal, it was systemic. The videos of his wrongful arrest had already begun spreading like wildfire. By the time David reached his office, his assistant had several trending hashtags on social media: illegal arrest, abuse of power, and justice for all. Dozens of news outlets had picked up the story, their headlines scathing: FBI director detained in shocking display of misconduct. Abuse of power, the arrest that exposed a rotten system. David sat at his desk, his hands clasped as he watched clip after clip of his arrest, each from a different angle. The outrage online was palpable, and the comments poured in faster than they could be read. This is why accountability is so important. How does a police officer not recognize the FBI director? This isn't about one man. This is about a broken system. It wasn't just the public who were reacting. His phone buzzed relentlessly, calls from colleagues, civil rights advocates, and even members of Congress. They all had the same message. This needed to be addressed, and it needed to happen now. David called an emergency meeting with his senior staff. As they gathered in the conference room, the tension was evident. Each face reflected a mix of concern and determination. "Here's what we know," David began, his voice steady but firm. "This isn't just about me. What happened today is a symptom of a much larger issue. And if this officer, Charles Thompson, felt emboldened enough to do this to someone in my position, imagine what happens to those without the same resources or visibility." The room nodded in agreement, the gravity of his words sinking in. "I want a full investigation," he continued. "Every complaint filed against Thompson, every arrest, every questionable incident. Dig into his records and see what else comes up. And don't stop there. Look into his precinct. This isn't an isolated problem. I want to know how deep this goes." His team sprang into action, and it didn't take long for the first troubling discoveries to surface. Charles Thompson, it seemed, had a history. There were multiple complaints of excessive force, unlawful arrests, and even allegations of targeting minority groups. Many of these complaints had been quietly dismissed or mysteriously lost in the system. But Thompson wasn't acting alone. His immediate supervisor, Sergeant Michael Hendricks, had a reputation for covering up misconduct and intimidating complainants into silence. The deeper they dug, the worse it got. Financial records revealed questionable transactions linked to both Thompson and Hendricks, kickbacks from private security firms, suspiciously large overtime payouts, and unexplained cash deposits. Former officers from the precinct, emboldened by the media coverage, began reaching out to share their experiences. "I left that place because I couldn't stomach it anymore," one whistleblower revealed. They had an unofficial watch list: activists, minorities, anyone they considered a problem. And if you spoke up, they'd make your life hell. By the end of the day, David's team had compiled a dossier thick enough to rival a legal textbook. But David wasn't content with just gathering evidence. He knew that for real change to happen, the public needed to see the full scope of the issue. He reached out to a trusted journalist, Rebecca Hayes, someone known for fearless reporting on corruption and abuse of power. When David shared the findings, Rebecca's response was immediate. "This is huge," she said. "But are you ready for the backlash? Because there will be one." David nodded. "I've spent my career fighting for justice. This is no different." Within days, Rebecca's exposé hit the airwaves. The story dominated the news cycle, with primetime coverage detailing not only David's arrest, but also the systemic corruption within Thompson's precinct. The footage of the arrest played on a loop, juxtaposed with interviews from whistleblowers and analysis of the precinct's dubious track record. The public's reaction was explosive. Protests erupted across Washington and beyond, with signs reading "No Justice, No Peace, and Reform Now." Crowds gathered outside the precinct, demanding accountability. Social media became a battleground, with hashtags like "Accountability Now" and "Reform the System" trending for weeks. But the scrutiny wasn't limited to the police. Political leaders faced mounting pressure to take action. Calls for police reform legislation gained momentum, with lawmakers referencing David's ordeal as a turning point. Meanwhile, inside the precinct, the atmosphere had shifted dramatically. Charles Thompson, once puffed up with self-importance, now avoided his colleagues' eyes. The whispers behind his back were constant, and the weight of impending consequences was evident in his slouched posture and downcast gaze. Sergeant Hendricks, too, felt the walls closing in. His usual bravado was replaced by visible anxiety as the media spotlight turned to him. David, however, remained focused. He wasn't seeking revenge. He was seeking accountability. He knew that for true justice to prevail, the spotlight couldn't just be on the individuals. It had to expose the entire system that allowed their behavior to flourish. And this was just the beginning. The chaos that had erupted in the wake of David Carter's wrongful arrest was unlike anything the precinct had ever experienced. With the nation's attention squarely on the case, every detail was being scrutinized, and it wasn't long before the cracks in the system began to show. David and his team worked tirelessly, poring through decades of records tied to the precinct where Officer Charles Thompson had served. The deeper they dug, the more unsettling the discoveries became. It wasn't just about Charles. Reports revealed a culture of systemic misconduct that went far beyond one officer's actions. Complaints of racial profiling, excessive force, and fabricated charges had plagued the precinct for years. Many of these allegations had been quietly dismissed or buried under mounds of bureaucracy. Among the most damning evidence was an unofficial watch list maintained by key members of the precinct. It included names of community activists, journalists, and residents from minority neighborhoods. These individuals were frequently stopped, harassed, or targeted with frivolous charges. David leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable as he reviewed the findings. His assistant, Emma Harris, entered the room, a stack of additional documents in her hands. "Sir," she began, her tone heavy, "we just found something else. Financial records." "It's not just Thompson." She handed him the file. "Sergeant Hendricks and several others have been funneling funds from questionable sources, kickbacks from private contractors, payments for consulting, things that don't add up." David scanned the documents, his jaw tightening. The corruption wasn't just operational, it was financial. The system wasn't merely broken, it had been deliberately manipulated to serve those who abused it. "This isn't just about one precinct anymore," David said, his voice calm but resolute. "This is systemic, and if we don't address it now, it's only going to get worse." He called for another meeting with his team. The room buzzed with activity as agents shuffled in, their faces reflecting the seriousness of the moment. David stood at the head of the table, his presence commanding, as always. "This is where we are," he began, gesturing to the stack of evidence on the table. "We have enough to take this to federal court. But before we move, we need to be strategic. This isn't just about Thompson or Hendricks. It's about sending a message that no one is above the law, not even those who enforce it." The team nodded in agreement, their resolve matching his. Plans were set in motion to escalate the case. Whistleblowers were contacted, legal advisors brought in, and media outlets were prepped for the next wave of revelations. Meanwhile, the public outcry continued to grow. Protests had spread to other cities, with thousands demanding justice and reform. Community leaders organized rallies, calling for greater accountability in law enforcement. Signs bearing slogans like "Equal Rights, Equal Laws, and Stop the Abuse" became a common sight. Rebecca Hayes, the journalist who had first broken the story, kept the pressure on. Her latest piece highlighted testimonies from those who had suffered under the precinct's practices. One story, in particular, struck a chord. A young man named Jordan Blake, who had been wrongfully arrested and held for days without cause. "They ruined my life," Jordan told Rebecca in an emotional interview. "I lost my job. My family and I were harassed for months. And for what? Because I didn't fit their idea of who should be walking in my neighborhood." The interview went viral, further fueling the public's demand for action. It wasn't just about David anymore. His experience had become a symbol of a larger fight, one that resonated with countless others who had been silenced or ignored. Back at the precinct, the walls were closing in on Charles Thompson and Michael Hendricks. Charles, once so confident in his authority, now found himself isolated. His colleagues avoided him, unwilling to be associated with the fallout. Hendricks fared no better. His attempts to downplay the situation only made him look guiltier. "You don't understand," Hendricks snapped during a tense meeting with his superiors. "This has been blown out of proportion." "It was a mistake." "A mistake?" One of the senior officials interrupted, his tone icy. "You think fabricating charges and harassing citizens is a mistake? This isn't about perception, Hendricks. It's about what you and your officers did." Both Thompson and Hendricks were suspended, pending further investigation. But for David, that wasn't enough. He knew that suspensions and temporary fixes wouldn't solve the root problem. The system itself needed to be overhauled. David's team finalized their report, a comprehensive account of the precinct's corruption and misconduct. Armed with this evidence, David made a decision. They would take the case to federal court. "This isn't just about punishment," David explained to his team. "It's about accountability. It's about making sure this doesn't happen again to anyone." The next step was clear. The legal battle ahead would be intense, but David was prepared for the challenge. He wasn't just fighting for his dignity, he was fighting for justice for everyone who had ever been wronged by a system that had failed them. And the nation was watching. The decision to take the case to federal court marked a turning point in the fight for accountability. David Carter and his team knew that this wasn't just a legal battle. It was a moral reckoning for a system that had long operated without meaningful oversight. The court filing named both Officer Charles Thompson and Sergeant Michael Hendricks as key defendants, but it didn't stop there. The suit extended to the precinct and the municipal oversight boards, citing their failure to address systemic issues that had allowed misconduct to thrive. The media frenzy reached a fever pitch. News outlets dissected every aspect of the case, with analysts debating its potential impact on law enforcement nationwide. Rebecca Hayes, the journalist spearheading coverage, published a searing editorial titled "Justice on Trial: How One Case Could Change Policing in America." "The arrest of David Carter," she wrote, "is more than an isolated incident. It is a window into the unchecked power and systemic failures that plague our law enforcement institutions. If even the director of the FBI can be subjected to such abuse, what hope is there for the average citizen?" Rebecca's words resonated deeply, and the public response was overwhelming. Protesters gathered outside the courthouse on the day of the preliminary hearing, their chants echoing through the streets. Signs reading "Accountability now" and "No one is above the law" filled the air. Inside the courthouse, David sat flanked by his legal team. His presence was both a statement and a strategy. This wasn't just about holding individuals accountable, it was about demanding systemic change. The defense attempted to downplay the allegations. Charles Thompson's attorney argued that his actions were misguided but not malicious, a claim that drew visible scoffs from the gallery. Meanwhile, Michael Hendricks' legal team painted him as a scapegoat for broader issues, insisting that the focus on him was unfair. But David's team came prepared. They presented an unflinching account of the misconduct, supported by irrefutable evidence. Whistleblower testimonies painted a damning picture of a precinct steeped in corruption, where abuse of power wasn't the exception, but the rule. Financial records and internal memos revealed a coordinated effort to cover up complaints, intimidate victims, and protect officers like Thompson from consequences. The most powerful moment came when Jordan Blake, the young man wrongfully arrested by the precinct, took the stand. His voice trembled as he recounted his experience, but his words carried the weight of truth. "I was treated like I wasn't human," Jordan said, his gaze steady despite the emotion in his voice. They didn't see me as a person, they saw me as a problem to be handled. His testimony silenced the courtroom, a stark reminder of the real human cost of unchecked power. As the hearing progressed, the defense's arguments crumbled under the weight of the evidence. Thompson's smug demeanor was replaced by visible discomfort, and Hendricks avoided eye contact altogether. The judge concluded the preliminary hearing with a scathing rebuke. "The allegations in this case strike at the heart of public trust in law enforcement," she declared. "This court will not tolerate actions that undermine the very principles officers are sworn to uphold." The case was officially set for trial, and the stakes couldn't have been higher. Outside the courthouse, the crowd erupted in cheers at the news. David stepped out to address the gathered reporters and supporters, his voice carrying the calm authority that had defined his career. "This isn't just about what happened to me," he began. "It's about what happens every day to people who don't have the platform or resources to fight back. Today's decision is a step toward accountability, but it's just the beginning. Real justice requires real change." His words were met with applause, but David knew the road ahead would be long and arduous. The trial promised to be a battleground, with both sides preparing for a high-stakes showdown. Meanwhile, the ripple effects of the case were already being felt. Other precincts began facing increased scrutiny, with citizens coming forward to report misconduct. Local governments announced plans to review police oversight policies, and activists seized the moment to push for broader reforms. For Charles Thompson and Michael Hendricks, the fallout was immediate. Thompson was officially terminated from the police force, and his career in law enforcement was effectively over. Hendricks, stripped of his rank, faced mounting pressure to resign. However, for David, the fight was about more than individual consequences. It was about dismantling the structures that enabled corruption and abuse. Back in his office, David reviewed the latest updates with his team. The workload was immense, but the progress was undeniable. They weren't just uncovering problems, they were building solutions. "We're not just holding people accountable," David told his team. "We're showing the world what accountability looks like." The gravity of his words hung in the air. The case had become a catalyst for a larger movement, and David was determined to see it through to the end. The trial of Officer Charles Thompson and Sergeant Michael Hendricks became the focal point of national attention, a lightning rod for debates about police accountability and systemic reform. News networks devoted primetime coverage to the proceedings, and the public hung on every development. Inside the packed courtroom, the atmosphere was charged with anticipation. Journalists filled the gallery, their pens poised to capture the next revelation, while protesters and supporters gathered outside, chanting slogans and waving banners. David Carter, seated beside his legal team, exuded calm determination. He wasn't just there as a victim. He was a symbol for everyone who had been wronged by a broken system. The prosecution opened with a powerful statement. "This case is not about one bad arrest," the lead prosecutor declared. "It's about a culture of misconduct, a system that allowed abuse of power to go unchecked, and the devastating consequences for those caught in its wake." The courtroom listened intently as the prosecution laid out their case. They detailed the events leading to David's wrongful arrest, showing clips of the viral videos that had sparked outrage. Each frame captured Thompson's arrogance and disregard for due process, a stark contrast to David's composed demeanor throughout the ordeal. Next came the broader evidence, a damning exposé of the precinct's practices. Financial records revealed suspicious transactions, while internal documents uncovered a pattern of falsified reports and fabricated charges. Testimonies from former officers painted a picture of a toxic work environment where misconduct was not only tolerated but actively encouraged. The prosecution also presented the testimony of whistleblowers, including former precinct employees who had witnessed the systemic rot firsthand. One officer, a former colleague of Thompson, described the precinct's unofficial quota system for arrests. "They didn't care if the arrests were legitimate," the officer testified. "As long as you brought someone in, you were considered a team player. And if you questioned it, you were labeled a problem." The defense, meanwhile, struggled to counter the overwhelming evidence. Thompson's attorney argued that his actions were the result of poor judgment rather than malice, a claim that rang hollow in light of his documented history of misconduct. Hendricks's defense attempted to distance him from the actions of his subordinates, portraying him as an overburdened leader who had been unaware of the extent of the issues within his precinct. But the prosecution wasn't finished. They brought forth key witnesses who had suffered under the precinct's abuses. Among them was Jordan Blake, the young man who had been targeted for simply walking in his neighborhood. His testimony was raw and emotional, his voice trembling as he recounted his experience. "They didn't see me as a person," Jordan said, his eyes fixed on Thompson. "They saw me as a number to add to their stats." The prosecution's final witness was David himself. Taking the stand, he spoke with the same poise that had defined his career. "This isn't about me," David began, his voice steady but resolute. "It's about a system that failed, not just once, but repeatedly. A system that allowed individuals like Officer Thompson and Sergeant Hendricks to operate without accountability, to the detriment of the very communities they were sworn to protect." He described the arrest in detail, from the moment he was stopped to the hours he spent in custody. But he also spoke to the broader implications, highlighting the need for systemic reform. "This case is a chance to set a precedent," David concluded, "to show that no one, regardless of their position, is above the law." His words reverberated throughout the courtroom, leaving a palpable silence in their wake. As the trial progressed, the defense's position became increasingly untenable. The weight of evidence was too great, and the testimonies were too compelling. Thompson's smug facade had long since cracked, and Hendricks sat slumped in his seat, the stress etched into his face. The public followed every moment of the trial with rapt attention. Social media buzzed with commentary, hashtags like Justice for All and Reform the System trending daily. The case had become more than a legal battle. It was a rallying cry for change. When the closing arguments were delivered, the prosecution left no doubt about the stakes. "This is a moment of reckoning," the lead prosecutor declared. "A chance to hold those who abuse their power accountable and to begin restoring faith in the institutions meant to serve and protect us all." The jury deliberated for hours, the nation waiting anxiously for the verdict. When the decision was finally announced, it sent shockwaves through the courtroom and beyond. Charles Thompson was found guilty on multiple counts, including unlawful arrest, abuse of power, and falsifying reports. Michael Hendricks was also convicted for his role in covering up misconduct and enabling a culture of corruption. Both men faced significant prison sentences, and their convictions marked a watershed moment in the fight for justice. Outside the courthouse, the crowd erupted in cheers. Protesters hugged one another, their voices rising in a chorus of celebration. Reporters scrambled to capture reactions, and social media lit up with messages of triumph and hope. David stepped outside to address the crowd, his presence met with thunderous applause. "This is not the end," he said, his voice carrying over the cheers. "It's a step, a vital step, toward accountability. But the work isn't finished. Change takes time, persistence, and unwavering dedication. Today, we've shown what's possible when we refuse to accept injustice." The crowd roared in agreement, their energy renewed. For David, the verdict was a victory, but it was also a reminder of the work still to be done. The trial's conclusion sent shockwaves through the nation, but for David Carter, the work was far from over. The conviction of Officer Charles Thompson and Sergeant Michael Hendricks marked an important victory, but it was only the beginning of a much larger battle. Within days of the verdict, federal agencies announced sweeping investigations into other precincts across the country. Whistleblowers were emboldened by the public attention and began stepping forward with stories of their own. Citizens shared their experiences of misconduct and systemic failures, reigniting long-simmering calls for police reform. David, seated in his office, sifted through reports pouring in from across the nation. His team had become a central hub for coordinating these efforts, leveraging the momentum generated by the trial. "Look at this," his assistant Emma Harris said, placing a thick file on his desk. "Another precinct, same pattern. Fabricated charges, disproportionate arrests in minority neighborhoods, and complaints that conveniently disappeared." David scanned the file, his expression grim. "It's not just a few bad apples," he said, almost to himself. "It's the entire orchard." The fallout from the case also forced local governments to act. City councils in several major metropolitan areas began reviewing police oversight policies, with some passing legislation to create independent accountability boards. Training programs were revamped to include modules on bias, de-escalation, and the ethical use of authority. But the changes weren't limited to policy. Communities began mobilizing to demand greater transparency from their law enforcement agencies. Grassroots organizations sprang up, organizing forums where citizens could voice concerns directly to police leadership. These meetings were often tense but necessary, bridging the divide between those enforcing the law and those subject to it. Rebecca Hayes, the journalist whose reporting had been instrumental in exposing the case, continued to document the ripple effects. Her latest feature, titled From Injustice to Action, the case that sparked a movement, captured the transformative impact of David's ordeal. David Carter's experience was a wake-up call, she wrote. It revealed not only the flaws in our systems, but also the potential for change when those flaws are confronted head-on. The question now is whether we can sustain this momentum. The public seemed determined to ensure that the answer was yes. Protests had evolved into organized campaigns, pushing for specific reforms at the local, state, and federal levels. Social media, once a battleground for outrage, has now become a tool for coordination and advocacy. Meanwhile, David found himself in high demand. Invitations poured in from civic organizations, academic institutions, and government panels, asking him to speak about the case and its implications. Though his schedule was grueling, he accepted as many as he could. At a town hall meeting in New York City, David stood before a packed auditorium. The crowd was a mix of activists, students, and everyday citizens eager to hear from the man who had become a symbol of accountability. "This isn't just my story," David began, his voice steady and resolute. "It's our story. It's about what happens when we allow systems to operate without oversight and what we can achieve when we demand better. Change doesn't happen overnight, but it starts with awareness and action." The room erupted into applause, a reflection of the collective determination to keep the movement alive. Not everyone welcomed the changes, however. Critics argued that the reforms were overly punitive and risked undermining law enforcement's ability to do their jobs. Some police unions pushed back hard, framing the movement as anti-police rather than pro-accountability. David was unfazed by the backlash. "Accountability isn't anti-police," he said during an interview on a national news program. "It's about ensuring that the power entrusted to law enforcement is used responsibly and justly. Without accountability, trust erodes, and without trust, no system can function effectively." The reforms also inspired introspection within the FBI itself. David led an internal review of the Bureau's policies and practices, ensuring that the agency he headed adhered to the same principles he advocated for. His efforts set an example, with other federal and state agencies following suit. The case also had a personal impact on David. Though he remained composed throughout the ordeal, the events had left an indelible mark. He often thought about the individuals who had come forward to share their stories, the Jordans of the world, whose lives had been upended by abuse of power. Their courage fueled his resolve, reminding him why this fight was worth every sleepless night and every difficult conversation. One afternoon, Emma walked into his office with a letter. "This came in the mail today," she said, handing it to him. David unfolded the paper and began to read. It was from Jordan Blake. "Mr. Carter," it began, "I wanted to thank you, not just for what you've done for me, but for what you've done for so many others who felt invisible. Your fight gave me back my voice, and for that, I'll always be grateful." David set the letter down, his throat tightening with emotion. Moments like these reminded him of the stakes, not just for the system, but for the people it was meant to serve. As the sun set over Washington, David gazed out his office window, the city alive with the energy of change. The road ahead was long, but for the first time in years, he felt a sense of hope. This wasn't the end of the story. It was only the beginning. David Carter sat in his office late into the evening, surrounded by the remnants of another long day, stacks of reports, half-empty coffee cups, and the faint hum of his laptop. The weight of his position had never felt heavier, but he embraced it. He understood that change, especially systemic change, demanded persistence and sacrifice. In the weeks following the trial, the momentum for reform continued to grow. Meetings with lawmakers became a regular fixture on David's calendar as he advocated for policies that could prevent the abuses he had experienced. His proposals included mandatory body cameras, independent review boards for misconduct complaints, and comprehensive bias training for officers. This isn't just about correcting what's broken, David told a congressional panel. It's about building a foundation of trust. A foundation where citizens feel protected, not targeted, by those sworn to serve them. The panel's response was mixed. While some lawmakers applauded his efforts, others raised concerns about the costs and logistics of implementing such reforms. David expected resistance. He had spent his entire career navigating bureaucratic hurdles, and he knew that meaningful change was rarely met without opposition. Meanwhile, the public continued to rally behind him. Letters of support flooded his office, some from people directly affected by police misconduct, others from citizens simply inspired by his resolve. One letter from a retired teacher in Ohio read, "Dear Mr. Carter, I've watched this story unfold, and for the first time in years, I feel hopeful. Thank you for standing up, not just for yourself, but for all of us." David folded the letter carefully, placing it alongside others he kept as reminders of why this fight mattered. However, not all the feedback was positive. Critics remained vocal, accusing David of vilifying law enforcement. Some pundits on conservative news channels painted him as a disruptor who was undermining police authority. David chose not to engage in public rebuttals, focusing instead on the work ahead. Privately, though, the attacks took a toll. Late one night, as David reviewed a particularly scathing editorial, Emma Harris entered his office. She placed a cup of tea on his desk and leaned against the doorframe. "Long day?" she asked gently. David sighed, rubbing his temples. "Long year," he replied. "Sometimes I wonder if all this is making a difference." Emma crossed the room and sat across from him. "You know it is," she said firmly. "Look outside. Look at the protests, the new policies, and the conversations people are having. None of that would be happening without you." Her words bolstered him, but David knew the road ahead was still fraught with challenges. The backlash wasn't limited to rhetoric. Threats began to trickle in, and anonymous letters and messages warned him to back off or face consequences. Security around him was heightened, and his family expressed concern for his safety. "I'm fine," David assured his wife during a rare evening at home. "This is part of the job." "But it shouldn't have to be," she replied, her voice tinged with worry. "You've done enough, David. Maybe it's time to let someone else take the lead." David shook his head. "If I step back now, what message does that send? Does intimidation work? That change isn't worth the cost? I can't do that, not when we're this close to something real." His wife didn't press further, though her concern lingered in her eyes. Despite the personal toll, David pressed on. The reforms he championed began gaining traction. Several cities implemented independent oversight boards, and federal lawmakers introduced a bill to establish national standards for police accountability. The bill, unofficially dubbed Carter's Law, became a rallying point for advocates of reform. But change wasn't coming fast enough for everyone. At a town hall meeting in Chicago, a young activist confronted David. "With all due respect, Mr. Carter," the activist said, "we're tired of waiting. We've been fighting for justice for decades, and it feels like we're still at square one. What are you doing to make sure this isn't just another moment that fades away?" David met the activist's gaze, his tone measured but empathetic. "I understand your frustration," he said. "Believe me, I share it. But real change doesn't happen overnight. It happens when we keep pushing, even when progress feels slow. And that's what I'm committed to, making sure this isn't just a moment, but a movement." The crowd murmured in agreement, though the tension in the room remained palpable. David left the meeting more determined than ever to deliver results. Back in Washington, his efforts began to yield tangible outcomes. The Department of Justice announced a comprehensive review of police practices nationwide, citing the revelations from David's case as a catalyst. Civil rights organizations partnered with lawmakers to draft policies aimed at closing loopholes that allowed misconduct to persist. Through it all, David stayed focused on the mission. His days were long, his nights often restless, but he found solace in the knowledge that the work he was doing mattered. One evening, as he prepared to leave his office, Emma entered with an update. "Carter's Law just cleared the house," she said, a rare smile on her face. David allowed himself a brief moment of satisfaction. "That's one step," he said. "Now we get it through the Senate." Emma nodded. "One step at a time, right?" David smiled faintly. "Exactly." The journey was far from over, but for the first time in a long while, David felt a sense of hope. The movement he had helped ignite was growing, and the changes it demanded were within reach. As he walked out of his office, the city lights of Washington twinkling in the distance, David Carter knew that leadership wasn't about seeking glory. It was about enduring the weight of responsibility and carrying it forward, no matter how heavy it became. The passage of Carter's Law through the Senate was the culmination of months of relentless effort. When the president signed the bill into law in a ceremony broadcast nationwide, David Carter stood among the attendees, his presence a testament to the transformative power of perseverance. "This isn't about me," David said in an interview following the event. "It's about the countless voices that demanded change and refused to be silenced. This law represents accountability, but more importantly, it represents hope for a future where justice isn't just an ideal, but a reality for everyone." Carter's Law mandated independent oversight of law enforcement agencies, required the use of body cameras nationwide, and established federal standards for police conduct. It also created avenues for citizens to file complaints without fear of retaliation. Though imperfect, the legislation marked a significant step toward addressing systemic issues that had persisted for decades. The reaction was immediate and varied. Advocates hailed it as a historic victory, while critics argued that the law imposed undue burdens on law enforcement. However, for David, the focus remained on the impact it could have on real lives. As the dust began to settle, David took a moment to reflect. His journey from that humiliating day on the streets of Washington to this pivotal moment had been anything but linear. He had faced obstacles, endured criticism, and sacrificed personal time and peace of mind. But he had also witnessed the best of humanity. People uniting, voices rising, and change taking root. Back at his office, David received a steady stream of messages from those inspired by his story. One email from a young woman in California stood out. "Dear Mr. Carter, I grew up in a neighborhood where police were more feared than trusted. Your fight gave me hope that things can change. Thank you for standing up when so many couldn't." David replied personally, as he did with many such messages. These moments of connection reminded him of why he continued to fight, even when the road seemed impossibly long. But David's journey wasn't without its lingering scars. The ordeal had left him more aware than ever of the fragile nature of power and the importance of vigilance. Though he had dedicated his career to upholding justice, his experience proved that even those at the top were not immune to its failings. One afternoon, he visited a youth center in Baltimore at the invitation of community leaders. The room was filled with young faces, and their curiosity was identified as David shared his story. "What happened to you wasn't fair," a teenage boy said during the Q&A session. "But you had the power to fight back. What about people like us? What can we do?" David paused, considering his response carefully. "You're right," he said finally. "Not everyone has the same resources or platform that I do. But change doesn't always start at the top. It starts here, in your communities, with conversations like this. Speak up, get involved, and don't let anyone convince you that your voice doesn't matter. Because it does." The boy nodded, and David could see the spark of determination in his eyes. Moments like these reaffirmed his belief that progress, though slow, was always worth pursuing. In the months that followed, David saw the effects of Carter's Law begin to take shape. Reports of police misconduct dropped in areas where oversight had been implemented. Communities began rebuilding trust with their local law enforcement, and a new generation of officers entered the force with a renewed focus on integrity and service. Bookmark. But not every battle was won. Resistance remained strong in some regions, and the implementation of reforms faced logistical and political hurdles. David knew that the fight for justice was far from over. One evening, as he prepared to leave the office, Emma Harris handed him a package. "It's from Jordan Blake," she said with a smile. David opened the box to find a framed photo of Jordan, now enrolled in law school. Attached was a handwritten note. "Mr. Carter, because of you, I found my voice. Now, I'm working to make sure others like me don't have to fight alone. Thank you for everything." David's chest tightened as he read the words. Jordan's journey, from a young man wrongfully targeted to a future attorney advocating for justice, was a poignant reminder of the ripple effects of accountability. As David left the office that night, he reflected on the road ahead. The work was far from finished, but progress was undeniable. Carter's law had laid the foundation for reform, and the movement it inspired continued to grow. For David, the experience had been both humbling and transformative. He had faced injustice firsthand, but he had also seen the power of resilience and collective action. The lessons he had learned would guide him for the rest of his life. Standing on the steps of his office, David looked out at the city skyline. The lights of Washington, D.C. shimmered in the distance. A beacon of possibility. Change, he knew, wasn't about a single moment or person. It was about the countless ripples created by those brave enough to demand better. And in that knowledge, David Carter found peace. The story of David Carter is more than a tale of personal triumph. It's a powerful reminder of the resilience of the human spirit and the importance of standing against injustice. Through the courage to confront systemic failures and the determination to demand change, David not only reclaimed his dignity, but also paved the way for reforms that would impact countless lives. This journey revealed stark truths about the fragility of trust and the consequences of unchecked power. It showed us that justice is not guaranteed by title or status, but must be actively pursued by those willing to hold systems accountable. Most importantly, it highlighted that even one voice, when used with purpose, can inspire a movement. The lessons from this story are clear. Accountability begins with courage, and change requires persistence. It's a call to action for all of us to remain vigilant, to support reforms that build trust, and to ensure that justice serves everyone equally. If this story moved you, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Was it inspiring? If you thought the story was good, comment with a 1. If you thought it was amazing, comment with a 2. And don't forget to share your own stories in the comments. Your voice matters. Make sure to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss more powerful and meaningful stories like this one. Share your thoughts about this story in the comments below. And let's keep the conversation alive.